The wind howled like a dying beast across the mountains of North Korea. It was December 1950, and the cold didn't just bite. It shattered bone, froze skin, silenced breath. Snow covered the ground like ash after a fire. Somewhere in that blinding white, a small group of Marines fought for their lives. The Chinese had launched their attack in the middle of the night, sudden, violent, relentless. Waves of soldiers descended from the ridges, screaming, firing blindly into the darkness. Men were torn from sleep by the sounds of grenades and machine guns. Chaos erupted. In the middle of that storm stood Hector A. Cafferata Jr., shirtless. Under his field jacket, hands shaking from the cold, rifle gripped tight. His position was exposed. His unit had been decimated, but he did not run. With a rifle and pure instinct, he fought. For hours, he held his ground against overwhelming numbers. No backup, no cover, just the will to stand between death and his. Holland Brothers, he was 21. In the snow, blood turned black. The screams faded. The barrels steamed in the cold. Cafferata moved like a ghost through the trenches, eyes wide, senses sharp, never blinking. That night would become legend. But in that moment, he was just a Marine, frozen, alone, and unwilling to let the line fall. Before he became a name etched in military history, Hector A. Cafferata Jr. was just a boy from New Jersey. Born in 1929 to a hard-working family of immigrants, he grew up surrounded by discipline, faith, and a sense of duty that ran deeper than words. Life was simple, not easy, but honest. His father worked in construction. His mother held the home together with quiet strength. Hector played football in high school, not because he was the biggest, but because he refused to quit. He was known for his grit more than his size, for his silence more than his swagger. After graduating, he worked in a glass factory. The days were long, the pay was modest, but he never complained. His friends talked about the draft, about the war across the ocean, about fear. Hector didn't talk much, but one morning, without announcement, he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. Why? Not for glory, not for medals, because it felt right. He trained at Paris Island, learning how to shoot, survive, and follow orders. But what made him stand out wasn't his aim, it was his composure. While others panicked, Hector stayed calm, focused, unshakable. He wasn't chasing a hero's journey. He was preparing for whatever came, quietly, completely. When the Korean War broke out, his unit was activated. He said goodbye to his family, packed his few belongings, and boarded a military transport without ceremony. There were no speeches, no tears, just a nod from his father and a quiet "be safe" from his mother. No one knew then that this silent young man, this factory worker turned Marine, would soon face an army alone. The journey to Korea wasn't glorious. It was long, cold, and quiet. Hector A. Cafferata Jr. arrived aboard a military transport ship in late 1950, one of hundreds of young Marines preparing to enter a war no one truly understood. He stepped off the ship into a different world, bitter winds, gray skies, and the smell of burning fuel. The terrain was unfamiliar, the language foreign, and the enemy invisible. But Hector didn't flinch. He followed orders, listened more. Then he spoke, and quickly earned the quiet respect of his unit. The days blurred into patrols, drills, and icy nights without sleep. The ground was frozen, the air razor sharp. Every breath hurt. They were stationed near the Chosin Reservoir, a name that meant little at the time, but would soon become legend. His gear was minimal. His rifle was heavy. His boots barely kept the frost out. Yet he never complained. He checked on the younger Marines, shared his rations, and kept watch when others needed rest. The whispers among the men grew louder. Chinese troops were closing, in thousands of them. The tension hung in the air like fog. On the night before the ambush, Cafferata sat quietly, cleaning his weapon by moonlight. Around him, most of the platoon was asleep, trusting the cold to keep the enemy at bay. But war doesn't knock, it crashes in, and when it came for them, Hector wouldn't be asleep, he would be ready. It began with a sound, faint at first, like the crunch of boots on snow, then more, then whispers, then shadows, then hell. The Chinese launched their attack under cover of darkness. Tens of thousands surged down the mountains, screaming into the night. The cold air shattered with the thunder of gunfire. Explosions lit the sky. The ambush had begun. Cafferata was jolted awake by a deafening blast. His tent ripped open by shrapnel. Men around him scrambled in confusion. Some struck before they could even rise. He had no coat, no gloves. He barely had time to grab his rifle. There was no time to think, only react. Outside, the hill was a blur of muzzle flashes and silhouettes. The enemy poured down in waves. His platoon was falling apart. Most were injured or disoriented. Hector ran to the front line, still in his undershirt, and took position in the open, alone. He knelt, raised his M1 Garand, and fired again, and again, and again. His hands went numb, but he didn't stop. Bodies dropped. Grenades landed nearby. Some he threw back before they could explode. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't look for backup. He became the defense. His breath steamed in. The air, blood mixed with snow. His ears rang from the blasts, but his aim stayed steady. For 5 hours he fought nearly alone, holding the line as wave after wave crashed against him. Reinforcements weren't coming. It was him, or no one, and somehow he endured. When the shooting slowed, his fingers were frozen, his legs burned. He had cuts along his face and arms, but the enemy had been pushed back by a single Marine. That night, the war changed, and so did Hector A. Cafferata Jr. The snow had turned red. For more than 5 hours, Hector A. Cafferata Jr. stood alone between life and annihilation. What began as instinct turned into survival. What started as reaction became something else, pure raw determination. His rifle cracked with each pull of the trigger. His fingers bled from the cold. His feet were nearly frozen. Still, he moved with brutal precision, firing into the waves of Chinese soldiers trying to overrun the hill. The bodies kept coming. They flanked him, surrounded him, outnumbered him. But they couldn't break him. When a grenade landed near a wounded Marine, Hector dove and grabbed it barehanded, hurling it back just before it exploded. The shock scorched his arm, but he didn't scream. He couldn't afford to. No one was coming. No one else was left. With each burst, he thought of his family back home, of the promise he made to himself, that he'd never let his brothers fall alone, that he'd hold the line no matter what. Time lost meaning. The sky remained black. The cold deepened. His rifle became an extension of his body, hot from constant fire, jammed and cleared with frozen hands. He fought until he couldn't reload, fought until he had no rounds left. Then he picked up a fallen comrade's weapon and kept going. At some point he was hit. A sniper's bullet tore through his shoulder. His vision blurred, his breath hitched. But he didn't fall. He gritted. His teeth, repositioned himself and kept firing. One man, one position, one impossible stand. And then, at last, silence. The final wave didn't come. The enemy pulled back, not defeated, but stunned. The ground was littered with bodies, blood, and discarded weapons, but Hector stood among it all. Broken, frozen, but standing. When his fellow Marines finally reached him, they stared in disbelief. What they found was not a soldier, but a fortress. Morning came quietly, as if the world itself was ashamed of the night before. The wind had settled. The gunfire was gone. Only the crunch of boots on snow remained, and the heavy silence of aftermath. Marines moved slowly across the battlefield, stepping over bodies, checking for signs of life. They found Hector sitting in a shallow trench, his hands frozen around the stock of a rifle that no longer fired. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, but he was awake, barely. Around him the snow was soaked in blood and ash. He had survived somehow. Medics rushed in. He tried to stand, but collapsed. His shoulder was torn, his legs stiff. He hadn't eaten in over a day. His body was shutting down, but his grip on consciousness held. They carried him back to the aid station, wrapped in blankets. As the truck rumbled away, he looked back at the hill. Now quiet, covered in fallen enemies and friends alike. There was no victory in his expression, no triumph, just silence. Back at base, the story began to spread. One Marine, one night, dozens of enemy dead. A defensive stand that had no explanation. Commanders wanted details, but Hector had little to say. They came, he said. I stopped them. It wasn't modesty, it was exhaustion and grief. In war, there are moments where everything changes, not because a flag is raised, but because a man refuses to fall. That was Hector's moment. But even he didn't fully understand what he had done, not yet. The official reports were clear. Hector A. Cafferata Jr. had single-handedly defended his position for hours against hundreds of enemy soldiers. His actions had saved the lives of dozens of Marines. He was, by every definition, a hero. But Hector didn't see it that way. At the military hospital, as he recovered from his wounds, generals and officials came to visit. They spoke of bravery, of duty, of honor. They asked him to recount the battle, to relive what had happened on that frozen hill. He gave them short answers, quiet nods, a weak smile. He didn't talk about the grenade he had thrown back barehanded, or the sniper's bullet that tore through his shoulder. He didn't mention the silence after the fight, or the faces of those who didn't make it, because to him, those memories weren't stories. They were scars. Months later in Washington, D.C., Hector stood in full uniform as the President of the United States placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. Cameras flashed, the room applauded, but his hands trembled. He didn't feel pride. He felt weight, because medals are not light. They carry names, screams, moments frozen in time. They shine, yes, but they shine over shadows. After the ceremony, a reporter asked him how it felt to be a hero. Hector looked at him, eyes steady, and said, "I'm no hero. The real heroes didn't come home." Then he walked away. Hector returned, home a national hero, but he didn't walk like one. There was no parade, no band, no celebration. Just the quiet rustle of leaves and the familiar creak of the porch as he stepped onto his family's front steps. He tried to go back to normal, found work, reconnected with old friends, attended Marine Corps events, smiled for pictures. But the war had left something behind, not just in his body but in his silence. He rarely spoke of Korea. When asked, he'd nod politely, change the subject or say, "It was cold." That's all. He visited the graves of the men he'd fought. Beside, left flowers, stood in silence, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Life moved on, but Hector moved through it like a shadow. He married, raised children, worked hard, never sought fame. The Medal of Honor stayed in a drawer, wrapped in cloth. What mattered more to him was the memory of those who didn't come back. He carried their names like a second skin, never visible but always present. In the quiet corners of life, he found peace, fishing at dawn, tending his yard, telling corny jokes to his grandchildren. He laughed, but his eyes always held something distant. He wasn't haunted, just marked, the kind of mark war leaves not on the skin, but on the soul. Hector A. Cafferata Jr. never wrote a book. He never starred in a movie, never gave dramatic speeches. He lived quietly the way he fought, steady, purposeful, without theatrics. But his story endured. At military academies and Marine Corps training grounds, recruits still learn about the frozen night at Chosin, about the Marine who stood alone, about the man who didn't run when the world collapsed around him. To the public, he was a recipient of the Medal of Honor. To those who knew him, he was something more, a man who embodied duty without ego. As he grew older, he continued to serve, in his own way, supporting veteran causes, mentoring young Marines, showing up when it mattered. He didn't seek attention, he simply showed up. When he passed away in 2016, the headlines called him a hero, but those closest to him knew he never wanted that word. He wanted to be remembered as a Marine, a husband, a father, a man who did what had to be done, nothing more, nothing less, and maybe that's what makes him unforgettable, because the greatest heroes are often the quietest ones. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to honor the legacy of those who stood when it was easier to fall. Hector A. Cafferata Jr. never asked to be remembered, but we remember him because his courage speaks louder than any medal. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to American Overcoming. Stories for more powerful true stories, and help us keep the memory of real heroes alive.